Let's let off the fireworks and remember the 5th of November. Hey guys, if you've just stumbled across this video, then hello! I'm Jade, a digital artist and illustrator, and this year I created my first colouring book. So with it being Bonfire Night today, I thought it would be fun to colour in my Bonfire Night Festival colouring page of my Festivals Around the World colouring book. First, of course, the supplies that I'm using are my twin alcohol markers. I recently got these markers and they have become my favourite medium to use for colouring. These ones are alcohol based, which has been so nice to experiment with. I have found since switching from water-based markers to alcohol-based markers, my colouring pages have taken a massive upgrade because I'm a lot more comfortable with blending and experimenting with the alcohol markers. Of course, because I'm using alcohol markers, I always make sure to have a sheet of card in between the page that I'm colouring and the next one. And then we have the colouring book itself. The book I am using is my Festivals Around the World colouring book, and the page that I will be colouring in is called Bonfire Night. The first thing that I do when colouring in a page is put down the base colours, starting with any characters. I like to have consistency with my characters, so I always use the same colours on every page, which is why I tend to start with my characters first because the colours are already picked out. I prefer using lighter colours for my dragons, so I used their respective colours. So Cookie being green and cream, Sparky being blue and cream, and Tinker being cream and pink. So then I move on to the shadows, and to do them I used a mix of darker colours and the same colours that I had used for the base colours. So for Sparky and Cookie I used a darker colour than their base colour for the shadows on their bodies, and for Tinker I used the same colour as her base colour. I did the same for the cream on all of them too. What is Bonfire Night? Bonfire Night, or Guy Fawkes Night, is an annual commemoration observed on the 5th of November, primarily in Great Britain, involving bonfires and firework displays. It marks the anniversary of the gunpowder plot failing when Guy Fawkes was discovered with barrels of gunpowder in the cellars underneath the Houses of Parliament in London. So now it is a tradition to let off fireworks and light sparklers on November the 5th. After colouring my characters, I like to move on to any other little characters in the scene, but as there are none in this page, I decided to move onto the bonfire in the middle. Right now I'm just adding in the base colours for the fire, so I'm using a red, an orange and a yellow. Then I am adding in some details around the edge of the fire. I am using a darker version of each base colour to highlight the middle and create shadows around the edge of the fire itself. Then the next area that I am going to focus on is the logs that each of the dragons are sitting on, and the ones around the fire. I'm starting with a light brown for all of the middles of the logs, and then I follow that up with a darker brown for the outside of each of the logs. For the bonfire logs, I used 2 types of brown for the outside, as I thought it would make the logs separate from each other and give them some more detail. Then I move on to the big trees, using the same 3 brown colours that I used for the logs on the grass. I wanted to create a more realistic looking tree instead of having block highlights and shadows. So to do this I started by putting down the lighter brown on the side of my light source and then added the darker brown on the opposite side. Then I added the middle brown in between the two. So to create a less blocky looking tree, I used my colourless blender to try and blend these three colours in. It was a lot of back and forth of adding more brown and then more blending until I finally got the full blended look that I wanted. Now going back to the logs on the grass to add more detail to them. I'm starting with the outside of the logs. For this section, I am just adding shadows below where each of the dragons are sitting and then around the outside of the logs. This is to create the effect of the light from the campfire. Then for the middle of the logs, I used a slightly darker colour than the base colour for around the edge, and then my colourless blender to take away some of the colour from the middle, creating a gradient. Moving on to all of the foliage and green sections, I am adding a base colour to the big trees in the back, which I chose a light to mid green. I am just slowly moving my way across the tree, making sure that I colour in the whole area. Then to add detail to the trees, I start by taking a slightly darker green and add this to certain areas in little upside down arch shapes. This is to create the illusion of bunches of leaves. Then I use a stippling technique, which is basically adding in a bunch of dots to an area around the bits that I have just added to the tree, making sure that I focus the dots in these areas and not just everywhere. Then I'm repeating the same process but with two other darker greens, focusing on the same areas as before. Stippling is a simple way to replicate the look of multiple leaves, as it's harder to draw them all individually. You can also use paint markers as well to add some lighter colours to the trees, as it's hard to do that with just markers, but for this page I decided to just go with the darker greens. So now moving on to the grass, I am using the same full greens that I used for the trees. Starting with the lightest green, I am just adding this to the middle of the grass around the campfire, and then slowly moving further out with the darker shades of green. This is to again create the feel of the light from the campfire. To add detail to my grass, I will be using acrylic markers, so you will see that later in the process. Then going to the final bit of greenery, I am adding a lighter green for the base colour of the bushes. I decided to go with a much lighter colour than the grass and the trees, so that the bushes stood out from those areas and didn't blend into them. Once all of the base colour is added in, I'm using the same technique and process that I used with the trees, but this time adding the blocks of colour to the bottom of the bushes and then the dots above. Now it's time for the biggest section of this page, the sky. For the sky, I want to create a gradient from light blue at the bottom to dark blue at the top, so it looks like the moon is rising as the fireworks displays take place during the night. So I kind of used the same process as how I did the big tree logs. I started with the lightest colour, and then once I had the bottom of the sky coloured in, I moved to a darker blue above. To blend the two blues in together, I kept layering them on top of each other to eventually create a blended effect. I then repeated this until I reached the top with the darkest blue. We are nearly at the end, and with all of the areas coloured and shadows added, the final part is to add any extra little details using acrylic markers. So the first part that I'm adding acrylic markers to is the grass. I'm just adding little lines using my light green marker. There isn't really any rhyme or reason to where the lines go, I just tried to make them look a bit more natural and less uniform. Then moving on to the final and most important part of this page, we have the fireworks. I of course used acrylic markers for these. I found this was the best way to cover the black outlines and make them look the most like fireworks. It did take a few coats to get the acrylic to cover the area because I haven't used my acrylic pens in a while, but it was definitely worth it. So I used a purple, pink, yellow, orange, silver and white to colour in each firework. I did want to use a light blue or a green, but there is already a lot of those colours in the page, so I went against that idea. If you made it this far and would like to colour this page yourself, then head over to my Etsy to grab either the physical colouring book that includes 18 different colouring pages, including the one that you are seeing today, or the digital bundle which includes 4 different pages from the physical book. And with that, the page is complete. I had a lot of fun colouring in this page with you today, so thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fun bonfire night and an amazing rest of your day. Bye!